The wind howled across the frozen wasteland of Proxima 9, a desolate ice planet at the edge of charted space. The research dome's reinforced walls vibrated with each gust, a constant reminder of the fragile bubble of life maintained within its confines. Outside, temperatures plummeted to negative 200 degrees, enough to freeze oxygen solid. Warren Keller tightened another bolt on the thermal regulator, his fingers numb despite the insulated gloves. The machine had been acting up again, threatening the delicate balance of warmth that kept the 23 members of the interspecies research team alive. He wasn't a scientist or a soldier. He was just a technician, a fixer, someone who kept things running. "Any progress?" called Dr. Lewis from across the common area, her voice tight with concern. Warren nodded without looking up. "The primary coupling is holding. Secondary needs a full replacement, but I've patched it. Should last until the supply drop next month." The truth was, he wasn't certain. The dome had been designed for a 6-month mission, not the 18 they'd endured since the discovery of the signal. Deep beneath the ice, something ancient was calling, pulsing with rhythms that defied analysis. Something that predated human civilization. Something worth extending their stay, according to the higher-ups safe in their orbital stations. Warren gathered his tools, ignoring the chatter around the common area. The xenolinguists were excited about a new pattern in the signals, the geologists about a newly discovered crevasse. They all had their specialties, their passions. Warren just had his toolkit and his small quarters at the edge of the dome. As he walked back to his room, he passed her door, unmarked, unlike the others with their name plates and personal decorations. They'd all learned to give her space, the lone representative of a nearly extinct species. Bonnie wasn't her real name, of course. Her actual name was unpronounceable to human vocal cords, a series of rumbles, clicks, and subsonic vibrations. The name Bonnie had been assigned for mission records, though she never responded to it. Warren had seen her in the common areas, of course. Tall, lithe, covered in short bluish-gray fur with patterns like snowflakes. Her face was feline in structure, but with eyes too large, too knowing, golden with vertical pupils that dilated in the dome's artificial light. The long, prehensile tail that she kept carefully wrapped around herself. Clawed hands that could manipulate the most delicate equipment with surprising gentleness. She was the reason they were here at all. Her species, the Lunari, had ancient ties to this sector of space. As a telepathic sensitivity specialist and xenolinguist, she was uniquely qualified to interpret the signals. But beyond her professional contributions, she remained a mystery. She spoke rarely, ate alone, and maintained distance from the human team members. Warren didn't mind. He understood the comfort of solitude, the safety in maintaining boundaries. After losing his wife and daughter in the Titan colony collapse 5 years ago, he'd found peace in isolation, in the rhythm of his work. No attachments meant no more loss. That evening, the team gathered for the weekly status update. Warren sat at the far end of the table, half listening as Dr. Lewis detailed the latest findings about the signals. "The frequency patterns suggest a neural structure," she was saying, excitement evident in her voice. "Not random emissions, but something designed to interface with sentient minds. Dr. Abra believes there may be a biological component." Dr. Abra nodded enthusiastically. "The signals strengthen when directed toward organic tissue. They seem calibrated to resonance with certain brain wave patterns." Warren noticed Bonnie sitting motionless in the corner, her ears slightly flattened. She hadn't contributed to the discussion, but her golden eyes were fixed on the neural pattern displays with unusual intensity. After the meeting dispersed, Warren returned to his quarters to run diagnostics on the secondary systems. The temperature in the dome had been fluctuating more than usual, dropping dangerously in certain sections during the night cycle. He worked until his eyes burned, then finally collapsed into his narrow bunk. He dreamed of ice that night, ice that whispered and sang, ice that reached up with crystalline fingers to pull him down into darkness. The emergency klaxon woke him at 0300 hours. The lights flickered, then died completely, leaving only the dim red glow of the emergency strips. The temperature was already dropping rapidly. He could see his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. System failure in heat exchanger 4. The artificial intelligence announced, its voice eerily calm. Critical thermal loss in sections 12 through 17. Emergency protocols engaged. Warren was already pulling on his thermal suit, grabbing his toolkit. Section 15, his quarters. The entire eastern section of the dome was compromised. As he stepped into the corridor, he could see others emerging from their rooms, confusion and fear on their faces. "Move to the central hub," he shouted, gesturing toward the common area. "The inner chambers are on separate systems." He headed in the opposite direction, toward the failing heat exchanger. The temperature dropped with every step, ice already forming along the edges of the corridor. His diagnostic pad showed a catastrophic failure in the main thermal core. This wasn't a simple repair job. The entire system had crashed. After 2 hours of desperate work, Warren had to admit defeat. The damage was too extensive, the parts needed beyond what they had in storage. The eastern section would remain uninhabitable until the supply drop. Everyone would need to double up in the central and western quarters. Exhausted and chilled to the bone, Warren made his way to the central hub. Dr. Lewis was organizing the emergency accommodations, assigning shared quarters. "Keller," she said when she saw him. "What's the status?" "Beyond repair," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold. "We've lost the entire eastern section until the resupply mission." She frowned. "That's 15 people displaced. We're already assigning bunks in the lab spaces." Warren nodded wearily. "I'll find somewhere. Don't worry about me." The truth was, he hadn't slept in shared quarters since before. The thought of it made his chest tight, but he pushed the feeling away. Survival first, feelings later. He wandered the dome, checking each space. The labs were already overcrowded, the common areas transformed into improvised dormitories. Even the storage rooms had been claimed by the time he finished his rounds. Exhaustion pulled at him, the adrenaline from the emergency long since burned away. Warren found himself in the western corridor, the least populated section of the dome. Most of the team avoided this area. It was closest to the dig site entrance, subject to strange acoustics from the ice and occasional unexplained equipment malfunctions. Only a few rooms were occupied here, primarily by the specialists who worked directly with the excavation. He tried a door at random, finding it unlocked. The room beyond was dark, but wonderfully, blessedly warm. Some sections had independent thermal systems, and this appeared to be one of them. Too tired to question his good fortune, Warren stumbled inside, barely managing to remove his outer thermal gear before collapsing onto what felt like a sleeping platform. The warmth enveloped him like a blessing, and he was asleep within seconds. Warren awoke slowly, consciousness returning in gentle waves. He was warm, wonderfully, perfectly warm. Something soft was pressed against his back, something that moved rhythmically, like breathing. His eyes snapped open, but he remained perfectly still. The room was dimly lit with a soft blue glow, unfamiliar in its furnishings. Minimalist, with strange organic curves to the sparse furniture. A few unrecognizable items hung on the walls. The breathing behind him continued, steady and deep, accompanied by a low, rumbling sound almost too quiet to hear. With excruciating slowness, Warren turned his head. Bonnie lay beside him, curled in a crescent shape that mirrored his own. Her eyes were closed, face relaxed in sleep. One arm was tucked beneath her head, the other resting lightly on her side. And her tail, her long, sinuous tail, was wrapped loosely around Warren's waist. Horror and mortification crashed through him. He had wandered into her quarters. He had collapsed in her bed. And now somehow they were... The thought cut off as Bonnie's eyes opened. Golden, with those vertical pupils contracting rapidly in the dim light. They stared at each other for one frozen moment. Warren opened his mouth to apologize, to explain, but before he could speak, Bonnie simply closed her eyes again. Her tail tightened almost imperceptibly around his waist, and the rumbling sound, Was she purring? Continued, uninterrupted. He lay perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Eventually, the artificial lighting began to brighten, simulating dawn. When it reached normal day cycle levels, Bonnie's eyes opened again. She regarded him silently, then unwound her tail and rose from the sleeping platform in one fluid motion. Without a word or glance back, she left the room. Warren remained motionless for several minutes after the door closed behind her, his heart hammering in his chest. What had just happened? Why hadn't she been angry? Why hadn't she said anything at all? More importantly, why had that been the most restful sleep he'd had in 5 years? The incident wasn't mentioned during that day's crisis management meetings. The team worked tirelessly to redistribute resources and reconfigure living arrangements, while Warren continued attempting to salvage what he could from the damaged thermal systems. Bonnie attended the meetings as usual, offered her cryptic insights about the signals, and gave no indication whatsoever that anything unusual had occurred between them. That night, Warren found himself assigned a corner of the xenobiology lab, a sleeping bag spread across an examination table. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the morning's strange encounter in his mind. The warmth, the softness of her fur against his back, the gentle weight of her tail around his waist, the rumbling purr that had somehow calmed his usually fractured sleep. The following days brought new challenges. 3 team members reported hearing voices near the excavation site, whispers that called their names and spoke of home. Equipment malfunctions increased, particularly in the communication arrays. Dr. Lewis ordered additional security protocols around the dig site, restricting access to essential personnel only. A week after the thermal system failure, the first person went missing. Specialist Rodriguez simply didn't appear for her shift. Her quarters were empty, her cold weather gear still hanging by her door. The search teams found nothing. 2 days later, Technician Yaboa disappeared during a routine maintenance check of the outer sensors. His tracks in the snow led straight toward the primary excavation site before disappearing altogether. The remaining team members gathered in the common area, fear evident on every face. "We need to investigate the crevasse that opened near the secondary dig site," Dr. Lewis announced, her voice strained but determined. The new fracture might be connected to the increased signal activity and possibly to the disappearances. She displayed a holographic map of the ice terrain surrounding the dome. "I'm authorizing a 2-person survey team to take core samples and place additional sensors. Minimal exposure, maximum 12 hours. Any volunteers?" The room remained silent. After a moment, Warren found himself raising his hand. "I'll go. I need to check the external thermal arrays anyway." Dr. Lewis nodded, relief evident in her expression. "Thank you, Keller. We need one more. I will accompany him." All heads turned toward the voice. Bonnie stood in the doorway, her posture straight, tail wrapped around her legs. Dr. Lewis blinked in surprise. "Are you sure? The protocols for I am best suited to detect signal variations in the field," Bonnie interrupted, her voice low and melodious despite its rarely used quality. "And my species is adapted to extreme cold." Warren stared at her, unable to process what was happening. Since that morning in her quarters, they hadn't exchanged a single word. Now, she was volunteering to spend 12 hours alone with him in the frozen wasteland? "Very well," Dr. Lewis conceded. "Prepare for departure at 0600 tomorrow. Full survival gear, emergency beacons, the works." As the meeting dispersed, Warren tried to catch Bonnie's eye, but she slipped away with her characteristic silent grace. That night, as Warren tried to find a comfortable position on the examination table, the lab door slid open. In the dim emergency lighting, he could make out Bonnie's silhouette. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, then approached his makeshift bed. Without a word, she settled beside him, her warmth immediately evident through the thin sleeping bag. Her tail curled around his waist, and that soft, rumbling purr began in her chest. Warren remained perfectly still, scarcely daring to breathe. After several minutes, he whispered why. Bonnie's purring paused briefly. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. You are quiet. Your mind is still. Not grabbing, not demanding. A pause. And you were cold. The simplicity of her answer left him speechless. After a moment, her purring resumed, and Warren found himself relaxing into the sound, into the warmth. They slept that way until the morning alarm, and when he awoke, she was already gone. The expedition to the crevasse began in darkness, the twin moons of Proxima, 9 providing the only illumination beyond their headlamps. They traveled on a small hover sled, loaded with equipment and their temporary shelter. Warren controlled the navigation while Bonnie scanned continuously for signal variations. The ice stretched endlessly in all directions, broken occasionally by jagged formations that rose like the skeletal remains of massive creatures. The wind carried ice crystals that stung any exposed skin and created ghostly whispers as they scraped across the terrain. They reached the crevasse by mid-morning. It was a massive fracture in the ice, at least 30 meters wide and stretching beyond the horizon in both directions. The edges were unnaturally smooth, as though cut by a precision tool rather than formed by natural forces. This wasn't caused by tectonic movement. Warren muttered, examining the edge carefully. It's too perfect. Bonnie stood beside him, her fur ruffling in the wind. The signal is stronger here, she said, her ears twitching. Much stronger. They set up their temporary shelter 20 meters from the edge, close enough for research, far enough for safety. The structure was simple, a dome of thermal fabric supported by flexible struts, anchored deeply into the ice. Inside, they arranged their monitoring equipment and began the process of collecting data. Warren drilled ice cores while Bonnie set up the signal receivers. They worked in comfortable silence, moving around each other with unexpected coordination, as though they'd been partners for years rather than strangers who had accidentally slept beside each other twice. As the artificial day progressed, Warren found himself stealing glances at Bonnie. Her movements were efficient, elegant even as she calibrated the sensitive equipment. When she concentrated, her ears flattened slightly and the tip of her tail twitched. He wondered about her world, her people, the civilization that had been reduced to a handful of survivors scattered across the galaxy. Your signal monitoring equipment needs adjustment, she said suddenly, interrupting his thoughts. The frequency range is too narrow. Warren moved to her side, examining the display. The specs say this should cover the full spectrum we've detected so far. Bonnie shook her head. There are subsonic harmonics. Your human hearing cannot detect them, but they are present. She hesitated, then added, they are familiar to me. Familiar how? Warren asked, reprogramming the equipment to her specifications. She was silent for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, they resemble the mnemonic patterns my people use for generational memory transfer. But distorted, hungry. A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down Warren's spine. Before he could respond, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. Equipment toppled as the ice groaned and cracked. Grab the emergency pack, Warren shouted, steadying himself against the shelter wall. We need to. The next tremor was stronger, sending them both sprawling. The shelter's support struts bent alarmingly, and one of the anchors tore free with a sharp crack. Outside, a new sound rose above the wind, a deep, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the ice itself. Move, Bonnie hissed, seizing Warren's arm with surprising strength. The crevasse is widening. They burst from the shelter just as another tremor hit. Warren watched in horror as their temporary home, along with most of their equipment, slid into the widening crack in the ice. The hover sled tottered at the edge for one heart-stopping moment before following the shelter into the abyss. They scrambled away from the edge, Warren clutching the emergency beacon and Bonnie with the survival pack slung across her back. Behind them, the crack continued to widen, hungrily consuming the ice plain. When they finally stopped, gasping for breath in the thin, cold air, they were at least 100 meters from where their camp had been. The crevasse had tripled in width, and from its depths came an eerie blue luminescence. "What is that?" Warren whispered, staring at the glow. Bonnie's ears were flat against her head. Her pupils contracted to thin slits despite the dim light. "Something ancient," she replied, her voice tight. "Something awakening." Warren activated the emergency beacon, praying the signal would reach the dome through whatever interference the crevasse was emitting. "We need to find shelter," he said, scanning the barren landscape. "The temperature will drop below survival levels once darkness falls." Bonnie pointed to a formation of ice spires about half a kilometer away. "There, the structures may provide windbreak." They trudged through the snow, the wind growing stronger with each passing minute. Warren could feel the cold seeping through his thermal suit, the battery-powered heating elements already struggling against the dropping temperature. Beside him, Bonnie moved with greater ease. Her species naturally adapted to cold environments. The ice formation turned out to be better than they'd hoped. Among the spires was a small, cave-like opening, just large enough for them to squeeze through. Inside, the space widened into a chamber about 4 meters across, sheltered completely from the wind. Warren activated a light stick, the chemical glow revealing smooth blue ice walls that curved overhead like a dome. The floor was relatively flat, covered with a fine layer of something like snow, but softer. "This isn't a natural formation," he said, running a gloved hand along one wall. "These are tool marks." Bonnie was examining the soft floor covering. "This is processed fibrous material," she said, "a form of insulation." This was a shelter. "For what?" Warren asked, though he already knew the answer. "For my ancestors, perhaps," Bonnie replied softly, "or for whatever communicated with them." She looked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the light stick's glow. "We're not the first to hear the calling from beneath the ice." They set up a minimal camp with the emergency supplies they'd managed to save. The pack contained a compact thermal blanket, emergency rations, a small heating element, and basic medical supplies. Warren set up the heating element in the center of the chamber, its gentle warmth a poor substitute for the shelter's environmental systems, but better than nothing. "The beacon is transmitting," he said, checking the small device. "But there's significant interference. It could be hours before they receive the signal, if at all." Bonnie nodded, settling cross-legged on the insulated floor. Then we wait. As the artificial day cycle ended, the temperature dropped precipitously. The heating element helped, but Warren could still feel the cold creeping into his extremities. He paced the small chamber, trying to keep his blood flowing. "You should conserve energy," Bonnie said, watching him. "Your body heat dissipates more rapidly with movement." Warren knew she was right, but the thought of sitting still while the cold slowly claimed him was unbearable. "I'm fine," he muttered. "You are not," she replied matter-of-factly. "Your core temperature is dropping. I can hear the change in your heart rate." Before he could respond, another tremor shook the chamber, this one lasting longer than the previous ones. Dust and small ice chips fell from the ceiling. "The awakening accelerates," Bonnie said, her voice barely audible. "It calls more strongly now." "What calls?" Warren demanded, fear and cold making his tone sharper than intended. "What is under the ice?" Bonnie's gaze seemed to look through him, beyond him. "Something that remembers my people. Something that knew us before." Her voice trailed off. "Before what?" She refocused on him. "Before we were scattered. Before we were hunted nearly to extinction." Her tail twitched, a rare display of agitation. "It promises to restore what was lost." Another tremor, stronger still. The heating element toppled, its light flickering before stabilizing. Warren righted it, his fingers clumsy with cold. "And what does it want in return?" Bonnie was silent for a long moment. "Vessels," she finally said. "Bodies to inhabit. Minds to reshape." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Warren. "The missing team members." She nodded. "It called them." They answered. Her eyes met his. "It calls to me as well." Night had fully fallen now, and the heating element's power was waning. Warren could no longer feel his toes, and his hands were becoming dangerously numb despite the thermal gloves. He huddled against the wall, trying to find a position that preserved body heat. "Come," Bonnie said suddenly, moving to his side. You will not survive the night alone. Before he could protest, she had settled beside him, her body pressed against his. Her natural warmth was astonishing, like embracing a furnace. Her tail wrapped around his waist, and one arm pulled him closer. This is how my people survive the cold, she explained, the rumbling purr beginning in her chest. Shared warmth. Warren gradually relaxed against her, the warmth seeping through his thermal suit. The purring created a gentle vibration that seemed to penetrate his muscles, easing the tension of cold and fear. Thank you, he whispered. Her reply was so quiet he almost missed it. You are welcome, Warren. It was the first time she had used his name. They remained that way through the long night, Bonnie's warmth keeping the deadly cold at bay. Warren drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with blue light and whispered promises of belonging. Once, he awoke to find Bonnie's eyes open, staring at the wall with unusual intensity. Her ears were perked forward, as though listening to something beyond human hearing. What is it? He asked groggily. She blinked, seeming to return from somewhere distant. It speaks of home, she murmured, of restoration, of unity and purpose. Her tail tightened around him. It would remake us all in its image. And you? Warren asked. What do you want? Bonnie looked down at him, surprise evident in her expression. It occurred to Warren that perhaps no one had asked her that question before. I want, she began, then faltered. I want to remember what we were, but I want to choose what we become. Her gaze intensified. The entity offers the first, but would deny the second. Morning brought no rescue. The beacon continued transmitting, but the interference had grown stronger. Outside, the wind had died down, but the temperature remained lethal. We cannot stay here, Bonnie said, peering out at the ice plain. The structure awakens faster. Soon, this entire region will collapse. Warren checked. Their supplies. The heating element was nearly depleted, and they had rations for perhaps one more day. We could try to reach the dome on foot. 23 kilometers in open terrain. Bonnie shook her head. You would not survive. We can't just wait to be rescued or buried alive, Warren argued. And we can't let that thing reach the dome. Bonnie was silent for a moment, then nodded. There is another option. The ancient facility beneath the crevasse. Warren stared at her in disbelief. You want to go toward the thing that's causing all this? The entity's physical structure must be biological or biomechanical, she explained. Your EMP device would disrupt its neural network. Warren blinked. My portable EMP? That's for emergency equipment resets, not. It would be sufficient if placed directly at the central node, Bonnie insisted. I can sense its location through the signal patterns. And how exactly do we get down there, find this node, and get out before everything collapses? Bonnie's expression was grave. We may not get out. Warren absorbed this, understanding the implication. A suicide mission, then? He thought of the dome, of the team members who might already be compromised, of the entity's hunger for vessels. All right, he said finally. How do we do this? They approached the crevasse cautiously. The blue glow from within had intensified, pulsing with an almost organic rhythm. The ice at the edge was slick, partially melted by whatever energy the structure below was emitting. There, Bonnie pointed to a section where the edge sloped more gradually. We could descend there. They used pitons from the emergency pack to create a rudimentary climbing system. The descent was harrowing, 50 meters down a nearly vertical ice wall, with a blue glow growing brighter below them. Warren's hands were numb by the time they reached the bottom, despite Bonnie's shared warmth through the night. At the base of the crevasse, they found themselves standing on something that was decidedly not ice. The surface was smooth, dark, and slightly yielding beneath their feet, almost like living tissue. The blue light emanated from vein-like structures that pulsed beneath the surface. What is this place? Warren whispered, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. A siege ship, Bonnie replied, her ears twitching as she scanned their surroundings. A fragment of a vast organism designed to transform worlds. They moved deeper into the structure, following the pulsing veins. The air grew warmer, heavy with an unfamiliar scent, something metallic and organic at once. The walls themselves seemed to flex subtly, as though breathing. As they progressed, Warren noticed changes in Bonnie. Her movements became stiffer, her eyes darting to follow invisible movements. Several times, she stopped abruptly, shaking her head as though clearing it. "It's affecting you," he said, touching her arm gently. "The signal." She nodded, her pupils contracting and expanding unevenly. "It knows me, recognizes genetic patterns, offers completion." Warren gripped her shoulders. "Stay with me, Bonnie. Focus on my voice." Her gaze locked with his, and for a moment, her eyes cleared. "The central node is near," she said, her voice strained. "We must hurry. I cannot resist much longer." They entered a vast chamber, and Warren's breath caught in his throat. The ceiling arched high above them, composed of the same tissue-like material, but transparent in sections, revealing the ice above. The floor sloped down toward a central pit filled with pulsing blue biomatter. Around the pit stood 5 figures, their missing team members. But they were changed. Their skin had a grayish cast, with blue veins visible beneath. Their eyes were eerily vacant, yet somehow aware. And in the center, partially emerged from the pit, was something Warren's mind struggled to comprehend. A massive, pulsing structure of flesh and crystalline formations, vaguely resembling a massive brain stem with tendrils extending in all directions. "The node," Bonnie whispered, her voice tight with strain. "And its first vessels." The altered humans turned as one to face them, their movements unnaturally smooth. "Join us," they spoke in unison, their voices overlaid with a harmonic quality that made Warren's skin crawl. "Become part of the restoration." Warren readied the EMP device, his thumb hovering over the activation switch. The unit was small, designed for localized equipment resets. But if Bonnie was right about the biological nature of the node, it might be enough to disrupt its functioning. "We need to get closer to the central mass," he whispered. Bonnie nodded, her body trembling with the effort of resisting the node's influence. "I will create a diversion." Before Warren could protest, she bounded forward with startling speed, her natural agility enhanced by what appeared to be desperation. She darted between the altered humans, who turned to follow her movements with their unsettling synchronicity. Warren seized the opportunity, sprinting toward the central pit. The EMP had a 5-second delay after activation, enough time to place it and retreat to what he hoped would be a safe distance. He was within meters of the pit when one of the altered humans, Technician Yaboa, or what remained of him, stepped into his path. Warren tried to dodge, but Yaboa moved with inhuman quickness, seizing his arm in a grip like iron. "The restoration requires your neural patterns," Yaboa said, his voice layered with that same harmonic quality. "Your individuality is an evolutionary misstep. Unity awaits." Warren struggled against the grip, but it was futile. Yaboa's strength was well beyond human capacity now. Behind him, he could hear Bonnie's growl as she fought against the others. Yaboa's free hand reached for Warren's face, finger splayed. "Your resistance causes unnecessary distress. Allow the transformation to—" The sentence cut off abruptly as Bonnie crashed into Yaboa from behind, her claws raking across his back. The altered human released Warren, turning to face this new threat. "Now!" Bonnie shouted, her voice strained. "Do it now!" Warren scrambled to his feet, lunging toward the pit. He activated the EMP and hurled it directly into the central mass. The device vanished into the pulsating blue tissue. "Run!" he yelled, grabbing Bonnie's arm and pulling her toward the chamber entrance. They made it halfway to the exit when the EMP detonated. There was no explosion, no visible discharge, just a sudden, absolute silence as the blue pulsing stopped. The altered humans froze mid-motion, their faces contorted in expressions of confusion and pain. Then the screaming began, not from the humans, but from the structure itself. A high-pitched wail that seemed to emanate from every surface, every vein, every tissue of the massive organism. The walls began to contract violently, the floor buckling beneath their feet. "It's collapsing," Warren shouted, struggling to maintain balance on the writhing surface. "We need to get out." They ran through heaving corridors, the structure disintegrating around them. The altered humans had collapsed, their bodies convulsing as the neural connection was severed. Warren felt a pang of guilt. They had been colleagues, friends, but there was no time to help them, no way to know if anything human remained to save. The climb back up the ice wall was a nightmare. The entire crevasse was shifting, ice breaking free in massive chunks. They had made it halfway up when a particularly violent tremor shook the wall. Warren's piton tore free, leaving him dangling from the climbing rope, spinning above a 60-meter drop. "Hold on," Bonnie called from above, her voice barely audible over the groaning ice. She secured her own position, then began hauling on his rope with incredible strength. Bit by bit, she pulled him up until he could grasp the edge of a small ice shelf. Together, they continued the ascent, each movement a battle against the disintegrating wall. They reached the surface just as a massive section of the crevasse collapsed, the ice falling away into darkness. The blue glow had dimmed to almost nothing, replaced by the black of fathomless depth. Gasping for breath in the thin, cold air, they staggered away from the edge. The tremors were subsiding, but the entire region had been transformed. New cracks spreading in all directions, ice formations toppled, the landscape rendered alien and treacherous. The beacon, Warren remembered suddenly, fumbling in his pocket. The device was crushed, broken beyond repair during their escape. "The dome," Bonnie said, pointing across the ice plain. In the distance, barely visible, was a column of smoke rising from the direction of the research facility. They set off immediately, though both were exhausted beyond measure. The journey was a blur of pain and cold, each step an act of will. Warren's thermal suit was damaged, its heating elements failing. Without Bonnie's warmth pressed against his side, her tail occasionally wrapping around him for additional support, he would have succumbed to the cold within hours. They reached the dome as the artificial night was falling again, or what remained of the dome. Half of the structure had collapsed, the reinforced panels shattered and scattered across the snow. Emergency lights flickered weakly from the intact sections, casting long shadows across the devastation. "Hello," Warren called, his voice hoarse from the cold, dry air. "Anyone alive?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind. Then a figure emerged from behind a section of collapsed wall. Dr. Lewis, her face cut and bruised, but very much herself. "Keller?" "Bonnie." She hurried toward them, disbelief and relief evident in her expression. "We thought you were dead." More survivors appeared from the intact portions of the dome. 7 in total, less than half of the original team. The structure, Warren began, but Lewis,